Sarah, how have you been faring in this year of the pandemic? How is studio work and how is life for you?
Well, I guess those are different questions. Studio life has been super productive. I have a great team, and we've worked really hard to do a very intense schedule of deadlines that didn't change. Some of them did change, some of them were moved. And I just really felt like part of my responsibility as an artist through the pandemic was to just keep working, and to sort of take in everything, all of the emotions and of the pandemic, and try and put them, sort of act as a conduit to put them into the work. Obviously, the conditions of the world have been incredibly tragic, so that's part of the condition of making the work. But I've been working. I just kept powering through it.
Yeah, I remember we texted like a month ago thinking about the exact date for the studio visit. It might even be a little longer, our first text. And for me, it was so interesting to hear that you are also doing in-person teaching. So this is really keeping up with not only your studio practice, but also teaching with students, like in person, which I think it's really wonderful that you're doing this, because because if you imagine to be in a studio to do student critique, I was really impressed by this. So this is really, really great you're doing this. When did you yourself, talking about teaching, when did you yourself know that you were an artist, that you would be an artist, Sarah?
So I think I was someone who was told that I was an artist even before I could speak my name. I was sort of the artist of the family. And I was told this in retrospect. Now that I have children, I can see this in my own children, where I was writing. I mean, I was drawing. I was making things, kind of nonstop. Going into a kind of world of making. And I was told that all through my life. And I think as a good artist, probably always not always, but stereotypically does, is my reaction to that was to kind of rebel against it. So while I continued to do it, I always sort of thought, since everyone has told me I'm the artist, I'm going to try and figure out how to diversify my interests and not feel like that label will always be with me. But over time, I realized when I didn't do art, I felt almost a physical sense of loss. That was really what made me realize that it was something I really have to do almost every day. I think that's also part of how I've survived the pandemic is just always making work every day.
Yeah, every day for me, it's also waking up, being grateful that we are still here. We are still healthy. And I have to say those studio visits like you and I are doing now for Mocha have really helped, because I feel that artists had a very inspiring and in the end encouraging way of dealing with these difficult times. Right now, I just starting our slideshow. This is a picture. I'm not saying a work. This is a picture this is a photograph of a painting from 1987. Do you want to say a bit about that, Sarah?
So you had asked me to choose a very early work. You said even from childhood, perhaps. And I had sent you a couple of weeks back a picture that will come up, which I felt like conceptually was a nice jumping point and had a good story to frame the work on. And then I was thinking about just even actually, I was actually talking to my students and really working with them to push their work and to make radical choices in their work. And my house, my parents' house is covered with paintings because I was painting since age 8, and they kept them all. And the walls it's almost like, it's a Victorian hang of all of these paintings. And so I called my father at about 11 o'clock and I said, do you want to just take some pictures on your iPhone, and send me some? And so I took the risk of sending you this. I think I made it when I was 16. I wanted to, there's a great quote by Philip Guston, and it says, the key to creativity is one's willingness to embarrass themselves. So I figured I would give you a very early work that has, I would be embarrassed to show, has never been shown outside the Z family house. But it was interesting for me to look at because at the time I was, I really was trained as a figurative painter, working from life. I painted from my friends. They sat for me. This is my friend from freshman year in college at Yale, Rebecca. And when he sent it to me and I got it on my iPhone, I this kind of intense relationship to that moment of painting her. And I think for me, it was interesting because the paintings were really about intimacy and about having a connection, my connection with someone I knew very intimately, and having that intensity between the subject and the painter, and having the viewer kind of caught in that moment. And I think that's still true for me in terms of subject matter. And I think in terms of just the way I was formally trained, a lot of the decisions that are threaded through every single work I had done since. But I was really trained in architecture and painting. Those were the two things that I was trained in. And when I went to graduate school, I kind of threw that all away.
How old were you when you started oil painting?
I looked it up. I was in 5th grade, so I was probably 9 or 10.
So the period between your parents encouraging you to be an artist and rebelling against it and then giving in must have been very early, must have been short.
No, I mean, I think I had very, very good teachers in oil painting from grade school through up till college. And then in college, I studied painting and architecture. I went in as an art history major. And when I graduated from college, I decided that I would do nonprofit work. And that's when I felt like this, what I talked about as almost like a physical pain of not being, not to make it dramatic, but I mean, I felt that probably only with like when my children are away from me or lovers are away from this kind of intense loss when I did that. And so that's when I went back to graduate school. But I went back to graduate school after about 5 years of full-time work outside of the art world.
Yeah, you got your BA in 91 at Yale, and then you did the 5-year nonprofit work. Your family seems to be a very service or public service oriented family. Your great-grandfather, he was the first Chinese student at Cornell and became the Chinese ambassador to the US. Your grandfather was very involved in founding the World Health Organization, which is incredible. So was that idea of public service always something that was kind of part of your work as well?
I think that's why I've always made it very important to at least, once a year, public projects move a lot because of construction and because of bureaucracy, but at least once a year I've made it a priority to do a public work. And I think having, art democratically accessible to people who don't even know it's art is a really important part of my commitment to be an artist. I think the teaching has to do with it too. With art, I think, great artists rarely really know fully if they've made a great work of art. But when you teach somebody, you really have a sense of giving something to them in that moment. And that I still find that I think teaching is a service, and one of the highest services that you can give back to a younger generation. So that's one of the reasons I still do that as well. But yes, I also think as an immigrant family, my father, and we talked about it. I didn't know this, but you told me that your family also were immigrants, and there was a kind of feeling of urgency to give back. There was a feeling that we were lucky to be here. There was some lack of freedom. I think we talked about that as well. I think my father, as an architect, he would have been an artist had he had felt the freedom in his family to do whatever he wanted. But as an immigrant, there was pressure on him to have a profession where no one could say, you're not a doctor, you're not an oncologist because of, your background. You have a degree in law, you have a degree in medicine, you know, in his case, in architecture, that art was so subjective that biases would be very hard to combat.
How was it running the non-for-profit as an early 20-year-old person? Was that fulfilling for you?
I mean, it was amazing. I'm very close friends with it. I totally lucked out. I had a team of people who were really brilliant, and I'm still very close to. I co-founded, we created a nonprofit, and my co-founder, I saw him just the other day. He works at Gates in education, and he's one of, you know, the most brilliant people I've ever met. You know, when we did it, I felt like, you know, I felt like he was the perfect person for the job. And I felt as if for me, I always had that, as I said, I always had this wandering eye to the art, and that I needed to try and fully immerse myself in it before I gave that up.
Yeah. But you did give it up, and we are all very grateful for that, for your career and all the works you contributed to us seeing and collecting and exhibiting and talking about right now. This is 1 year before you joined SVA. That's from '95. And do you want to say a bit about this? We actually have a second slide of this. If we go to the second.
So
explain a bit about this work.
So actually, maybe the dates may be labeled wrong. So that is the first year, but actually probably 95. It's probably 95 because it's probably the September of it. So that's the first work I ever did at SVA. And what happened, it's kind of a nice story. Actually, maybe go back to the one before. That was the size of an SVA studio. We didn't have walls. And after the first week, there was a person in this program who had a nervous breakdown, and she left. And so the studio was left empty. And we all just, by chance, we pulled out of a hat. Everyone was allowed to have it for, you know, a week to do a special project, because our studios were quite small, as you can see. And so I actually got the first opportunity to use her studio. And she had just left one day, and all of her things were in the space. And so what I did was I dusted the space with eraser dust. I erased all of the things that were in the piece and made it into dust, in the room that she had left. So those are all her things. And then I removed all of her things. And so I left this kind of, you know, it's almost like a cyanotape or a print or a sculpture, but also it's very performative. And I think, you know, you and I also are very interested in the performative aspects of or the remnants of performance, or the remnants of behavior. And so that's the first piece I did at SVA. And I thought it was also interesting the reason this was the piece I was going to start with, because I think it has a lot to do with, you know, how pieces generate each other. How when you look at an artwork, you're seeing something in process, and it has a past and a future, and you see it in that moment. And that I think has continued a lot in my work, this idea of the empty space creating the full space, the idea of where does the piece begin and where does it end. But I also put it
begin and where does it end? That's a very good bridge to this one here. This is the Soho Annual in 1996.
Yes. So my next question after the eraser dust piece was sort of, why do we make objects? And because I was a painter, so I was like, okay, let's talk about objects. So, you know, why does an object, or why does a material seem more valuable than another material? What makes something in a museum, or, you know, outside of a museum? Well, how does something become valuable? So I decided, as a graduate student with very few materials around, to use up all the SVA toilet paper, and I used toilet paper as the material. And I just decided to create a set of rules. And I took one piece of toilet paper and sat down in the corner of my studio, made something until I was bored of it, and then I would make another shape. And the entire studio filled up with this. What I was interested in, what it became, was a kind of weather. That the piece, the sculpture itself, was kind of completely created a kind of weather, and mixed in with what was there in the studio. And then I was asked to, while I was still very early in graduate school, I was asked to show the work, and they wanted to put it in the gallery right in the middle, like a blanket. To me, which seemed like completely wrong conceptually about what the work was. And it's sort of like something that we had seen already. Not that that work wasn't good work, that kind of work,
Yeah.
but that wasn't what the center of the work was. So it's also something I tell my students to do. You really have to be careful when you move the work into other people's worlds, because they may not, you have to be sure of where the work comes from, right? And it was really important to me that these things were amalgamated into an environment that that I hadn't created, that they landed there, and they created a new conversation between something that was existing and that's something I brought. And the borders where it began and end were melded. So this was a back room in the gallery that was abandoned.
How long did you work on that piece?
God, I mean, pandemic time was hard already, but me with time has always been a problem, which is in the work. I mean, part of it I think is probably about marking time and space, right? Quite literally.
Exactly.
I mean, I installed it here was I put it in little Ziploc bags. I went into my studio and Ziploc bagged it up, and then I Ziploc bagged it back, right? So it also had this performative kind of aspect to it. I don't think laying it back out took that long. I guess you're just putting it down, right? I think a lot of my pieces people think they're much harder to install than they are, because they're similar to like moving your home. You can move your home, and it's really just labor as long as the decisions are made about, about light, about how you enter, about what you see next. So I don't know, but I would say
it was one of the first two pieces I saw, and my question at the time was, God, how long did she work on making all these single objects in a way? And if we go to the next slide, that led to a very different, that was, I think, at White Columns, this piece here, that was these two pieces in '96 were the first two pieces I saw. And while the first one is for me was more performative, because I kind of imagined you in the process of making all these objects, just like one piece of toilet paper at a time. This one I felt, and I talked about like civil service and society and urbanism. This for me was more like all of a sudden it became a city. Yeah. It wasn't about the work you put in. I felt it was a model of the world. And I was so impressed. I think I kept on calling you. How many times did I call you when I saw that?
Very persistent. I mean, for me, this piece was, the important thing about the other piece was I did not want it to be just about labor and monotony. And I wanted to highlight this idea of the blurred edge between when something becomes an artwork and when it doesn't. And when something that we find extremely common and accessible in our daily lives as an object, when it when it crosses the line to having value, where's the hand in it? Maybe we can go to is there another two of it?
No, it's only this one of the Untitled Studio.
So, okay, so the point was to blur this all together and to let it build almost like its own organism. So I started thinking about, how do we place value on objects? And really value is, I think, created by, whether things have life, right? The things that are living are the most valuable things. So if your house burns down, you take out the people, you take out the animals, and maybe next you take out the art. So why is an artwork live? How does it embody life? And this very age-old idea of how do you breathe life into objects? Like why, when you walk through the Met, you have literal conversations with people over ages, like one-to-one. You can stand in front of something and have a conversation with someone through an object. So for me, it was this idea of let's push all of these things together and then see if in their relationship, they become almost like a living organism.
Yeah, you mentioned you studied painting and architecture. Your father is an architect. When this work was installed at White Columns, that was a moment where art and architecture also were at a point of a discourse. There were exhibitions about art and architecture, crossover exhibitions. And I think at the time you were still a student, we had a very inspiring conversation about this and your processes and how you also inserted your work as a sculpture into architecture. So we saw the one work behind the shelves, behind the wall, this here as a studio work. And if we go to the next, this was the first work you and I worked together, where you basically, there was this little electro closet here that you saw because it wasn't closed. And you basically started inserting your work into this closet, and we see details. You also mentioned beings, life, there's water, there's an aquarium, there's plants. And you see in the back, you see actually the fuses and details from the electrical closet. And if we go to the next one, you end up coming out of through the building. It was a little bit like in that movie Brazil, where something goes into an architecture and comes out. You came out again in the broom closet, a floor upstairs or 2 floors upstairs, and ripe fruit falling. You see all of these, yeah, also organic and materials, and you see the little figure here on the sponge. And that was 97, you were still a student, and this was the beginning of not only working with each other, but also nearly 30 years of friendship in a way. Say a bit about this work that goes into the architecture and finds itself out of the building again.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was really interested. That was the reopening of PS1, and they'd sort of cleaned the building up, and in a good way, needed to be for safety reasons. But I also loved the rawness of that building. I loved the history of it, having been a school, and there were so many things that were done there historically that were so radical, and probably would have been very hard to do in a more sort of structured museum environment. So I almost wanted to regain that, like pull out the guts of the building itself, and to show you behind that white wall what was there. So actually, with this room, when you showed me this room, I remember I looked at the plan, and this comes from my architectural training. I mean, I always look at a plan before if I can't see a space first. And I could see that in the plan that's where this major, it was not just like the electrical for the room, it was for the whole building, and all the alarm systems were connected to it. So you probably would never be able to do this again. But at the time, it was this, I wanted to create this sense of also the danger of our built environment and how fragile our built environment is, and that our built environment really is an organism, that so there was water coming out and going into that terrarium. There was air, so that kind of why it's blurry, and that was a piece of toilet paper that's constantly being blown. There was air coming out of it. So all of these sort of systems that we support us, but we don't think about. I wanted them to be sort of raked out of the interior, almost like opening of an operation and pulling out, where you look inside and you can't believe that that's actually what's keeping the whole building alive.
It wasn't.
And also these kind of interstitial, these spaces that are unknown or unused. It was, I was thinking about Gordon Matta Clark, one of that piece of my favorite pieces, the plots. How do you make space out of how do you create space, or what is the space that's there that is overlooked? It's always part of it.
Yeah, if we go to the next slide, and this is only 24 years. We both said, oh, it's nearly 30 years. No, it's only 24. Let's not exaggerate. Next year, I want to take a group from MoCA to Berlin for the Berlin Biennial. The next one is going to be curated by an artist, by Kader Attia, just went public, so I'm not spilling any secrets here. So we're all going to go. But at the time, it was a curated by curators, a curated show, not run by artists. And the first Berlin Biennial had artists that lived and worked I nearly said LA, lived and worked in Berlin. So we offered you a residency And you came with a prepared work. I had to think about it and smile a bit. You came with a shower stall, one of these ready-made shower stalls. It shipped to Berlin. You arrived, you came to the studio, and you said, oh, I brought a work. And I basically said, well, you have a residency. Perhaps you get started on working. And you worked in this quite historically, it's historically both a sad and an impressive space in a way. Do you want to say a bit about this work, Second Means of Egress from '98? It was.
It was an incredible time in Berlin, right? Because Berlin was in such, there was many cranes building as there were, and destroying buildings as there were buildings. And this is a building that's been demolished since, with a very tragic history. And it was bombed in World War II, and there were cracks throughout the whole building. And there were little measuring devices to see how the building was, beginning to literally fall apart. And this actual room, there were amazing pieces. There was like a Wolfgang Tillmans, a Thomas Demand, and a Manfred Pernisi, and also in this space. There's a kind of incredible group of artists in that first Biennale, but that flanked this. But this piece was in Albert Speer's studio, Hitler's architect. And so I wanted to make a piece that was kind of almost maniacally trying to build beyond its own capacity to support itself, and had this, it almost shivered. And it's funny because you can't, the reproduction, you can even see it in these pictures. These are obviously film. And we have I don't think we have any, maybe you can dig it up, but I don't think we have any video of this piece, but the entire piece shuddered because of a very small detail at its base. And it followed the organic crack, and then it escaped through, we broke open a hole in the ceiling to sort of create an escape route. And it was called Second Means of Egress, which is a technical architectural term for the need to have a second exit in the case of emergency. So it was really very much about, sort of, for me, terror and escape and emergency, and this incredibly haunted space that I was working in.
Yeah, yeah. Really a sad history. And then what you did and other artists basically were directing the attention to the history and making people aware where they physically are, because this space was still completely in ruins. It was kind of left without repair, so to say. And this was a time, Sarah, where you had Migrateur at the Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris, you had the solo show at the ICA in London. You were basically, I don't know how you all did it, but you had shows everywhere. And then very soon later, you had your first solo show at the MCA in Chicago. If we go to the next slide. And that's actually a video. Let's watch it, please. And we have a slide also, if we go to the next. This piece for me is really important, not only because this piece now is at MoCA, because we are very fortunate and grateful that this piece is in the collection. It's really such an important piece, but it is also such an important piece because for me, it marks a point of departure and changing point in your career, in your work. Somehow, moving images, projections became parts. Somehow your pieces started to move much more, while perhaps the Berlin piece had a bit of a tremble and a movement in it. This piece really became kind of the starting point for your mature work, because, sorry to say that mature work, but because you were so young at the time and you had only like 3 years of a career, a public career then. But say a bit about what inspired you. And
I'm still not in my mature work.
Of course not. Of course not. You are.
Die with a hammer and a paintbrush in my hand, Klaus. So,
Yes. Do you want to say a bit about that moment that inspired you to bring projection and moving images into your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think even in '99, I felt this. I remember graduating from school, and we just the web had just become, people didn't have computers in their studios. I remember when I came back from Berlin, I brought a cell phone, and I was shamed for it. There, what is the cell phone? So, but I remember feeling this very intense feeling that objects and images were beginning to merge, and that we were having a kind of dysphoria or confusion between what was an object and what was an image. We were relating between objects and images. They were in a kind of debris. And I had a good friend actually who worked in Times Square, which is not so far from this studio is still the studio I worked in. It's just gotten bigger. But I used to live in it, and now I'm able not to live in it. But and I used to go to Times Square because he worked for Sony, and we did all of the video there. And then he moved to LA, and it was actually just untenable to do video work for me at that time. Now I would say 90% of the work I do on video is on this. So within my lifetime, I'm really this cusp generation. Zadie Smith wrote very beautifully about, I think, our generation, where we were mature before the storm hit. We weren't right in the middle of the storm, and so we have a kind of inside-outside relationship to it. Whereas my children are, their language is fully merged with the digital and the analog. So in this piece, I was very interested in. There were a few pieces around that time with trying to create a space where you were shifting between something that was analog and something that was digital, something that was a picture. There's actually pictures in there of like snakes and wild animals, which I'd forgotten, which is interesting because they're in the more recent work. You can see in this picture there are film boxes, and to me that was kind of this funny idea of knowing that those film boxes would become antique. So it was this kind of, if there was value in it, if I was looking originally at how do we create value in an object, how is that value dispersed and how is it made sense of when the image melts into the object and vice versa. So it was a very important piece.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited that it is here in the collection. I think it's really a paradigm shift in your work. So if we go one slide further, this was the Whitney Biennial. At the time, you really were at every single biennial: Venice Biennial, Whitney Biennial, Sao Paulo Biennial, Berlin Biennial. You did all of them. And here we see the Breuer building, the famous windows that you are bursting around. I'm not saying through because you kept it intact. Do you want to say a bit more about this really important piece, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's things we've talked about in terms of like the architecture. I chose that location as this kind of iconic, really interesting, like, very radical use of a building. I love that building. And I think that the eyeball window was this kind of amazing play with the frame and how you bust the frame, how you play with perspective, how you play with the inside and the outside. And I was interested in having a direct conversation with this kind of frame that was pushing you out into space and changing your relationship to the outdoors. And it was interesting to look at it in retrospect because, I was interested in, this word is obviously so loaded now, but in this idea also of the viral, of something that sort of grows into its environment. And then have a conversation with the environment itself. So you would feel like this thing had developed on site and would still develop. So that whenever you came to an artwork, you were coming to it in a very specific time in its creation. That if you came back 2 more days, it may have, entropy may have set in or growth may have set in. That this idea that you could make a piece that was sitting right between growing and dying, and that moment of seeing it would be heightened because of it.
Incredible. We go to the next slide. It's actually a video. Just let's watch it. It is at Tanya's gallery, right?
Yep.
It's a portable planetarium, which I think for me was very important because I always saw your work as models, but more of models of cities or societies or of urbanization. Whereas I saw this work was the first time where I saw it was a model of an instrument. It was a model of an instrument, like a scientific instrument that helps you to see, to explore, that helps you to perceive the world in a different way. And for me, that's the reason that work is 360 Portable Planetarium. Here we have a close-up of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, I started to think about, the difference between an architectural model and a scientific model. An architectural model being potentially something that you build as something that will be scaled up. I've always been playing with scale in the work and how you can pull someone in and pull someone out. So that was something I learned, I think, and played with in architecture. But I wasn't building the sculptures to be built larger, which is what an architectural model usually is a performative tool for that. I was more interested in this modeling behavior. So even this idea of calling it portable planetarium, it's very not portable, right? I liked the idea. I was always very interested in Russian kiosks and the idea of a kiosk, the idea of a portable information center that you could sort of pack up, and they're beautifully designed, and are these towers that you see by the Russian constructivists have beautifully designed. So I thought of it a little bit as, and even in New York, I love these kind of, and in Delhi, where you just these people like pack up an entire newsstand and then like set it up again, and that you could have this portable thing. But of course, when you look at it, it's completely not portable. And part of that contradiction was this kind of idea of, the inevitable failure of trying to imagine the universe, that it's beyond our capacity always to imagine. But I gave myself a huge, a huge permission card in this work to, as you pointed out, to model something that is almost like a classic model we already knew. And that's not something that I had done before. But I said, if I'm modeling if it's a scientific model, let's look at it. Let's look at scientific models. And instead of making a model that was about seeing the outside of the Earth, it was much more about how you could enter it. And that dynamic, I think, became very interesting to me. It was something that I got a email. It was a beautiful email from Bruno Latour, who was like, I traced you down because I've been trying to model this idea that the Earth is not a solid structure. The Earth is a very thin biosphere that is very, very fragile. And if we could understand that it's not this image of, the blue marble that we see from the sky, we wouldn't be banging at it all the time. We would treat it differently. So that was I developed a really interesting relationship with him. But this idea that goes back to the very beginning of this idea of how fragile a moment is and how fragile an artwork is in terms of its ability to express life.
And how fragile life is, exactly, because also we come later to more of the works that has this as a topic. If we go to the next slide, in 2013, you were representing the United States in Venice at the Venice Biennial. I always recognize the ornamentation in the middle room. And when I looked at it yesterday, I was like, oh yeah, of course, that's the floor. Let's look at the drawing. Let's go to the next, but go to the next one. So we have an idea of the vector and the spiral that was an underlying principle. Here's a detail, and let's go to the next. And of course, it wouldn't be a Sarasi if it would stay in its confines. It never does. And all nature and the roof and the yard and the atrium, everything is included here. If we go to the next. So the inside and the outside.
And I think one of the important things about that transition you just did is this is what's behind. The building is very symmetrical. And so what I did, but the things that's made it not symmetrical is the death of the trees. So if you look at the building when it was first built, there's colonnades of trees all around it. And the only thing that's left is this one tree, and it throws off the asymmetry. So everything that was outside was to kind of throw off this Monticello stolen from, Palladio, kind of, this is the center of the earth. And so this one room, I wanted, the first image shows the circulation, that you don't know that you're going to get to this room. And something actually, what I spent like a huge amount of my budget on was redoing the front door so that you could travel through that space as a circle. And I think that since I spent the money on making the fire doors go the other way, because they had to be handcrafted because the whole building is landmarked. I don't think anyone has changed it since, I have to say. I think that everyone uses it that way, because that building always had a very awkward thing of going back. So the circulation was changed. And this last room in the 70s, actually Robert Rauschenberg was in the group of printmakers who tore out the wall. And they had covered it almost always since then with a kind of fake linoleum painting of bricks. But because it's landmarked, you couldn't do anything to the building, but you could take that away. And so I took this room and then I mirrored it all around the edges of that. So when you came to this at the end, it was like the chapters of a book, right? So the circulation for me of how you tell a story when you have the opportunity to do several pieces in a row was very important. That you came and you thought, oh my God, this is this crazy thing outside the confines. You went in, and then by the end of the series of the room, you realize what that cacophony on the outside was framing.
I love the moment when you describe how you changed the doors. So it was beautiful to remember this, and also looking forward to, I think the next time, hopefully going through these doors, I will remember they're yours. What a change. So let's go to the next one. And with this work, we have a little video. If we go to the next, you can actually see this here as a video, because I think it's beautiful to see the movement, because the images don't do it right otherwise, the pendulum.
Klaus, do you recognize the lines on the floor?
I recognize the lines in the floor, and I remember the moment you and I first looked at that together, exactly that location. How did it feel, Sarah? How did it feel to represent the United States as an artist? How does that feel? Was that pressure-wise, expectation-wise, politically? What would you say about that? Because I always wonder when an artist is asked to represent a country. And Venice as a biennial, of course, was a little bit like the Olympic Games, organized nearly like a competition where the countries would present their most accomplished artists. So traditionally, it has been a competitive biennial, and there's even a biennial prize. So it is literally competitive.
Right. I mean, that whole structure is really is a funny layover, right? Very much a pre-internet layover, where you came to world fairs and you learned about what Germany had to offer and what Japan had to offer. So it's a very antiquated structure, obviously, but it's a huge honor because you have an incredible audience. You have an international audience. You have the American Pavilion is a place that most people go to if they go there. And so you have an opportunity to have a voice, which is, of course, an incredible privilege. So I loved it. I loved doing it, and I love Venice. Bob Gover called me up in the beginning, and it was incredibly helpful as a mentor to me. Really walked me through what that would be like, and I'm forever grateful to him because it's kind of new every year. But I was going to say that I feel like it's something when I go into any space, and it's something, actually, this is another thing when you look back as look at myself as a child, having architect as a father, we would go into any room and I would start thinking about, oh, when was that renovated? How big was that? Why would you want a window to be bigger than a person? What are the philosophical, basis is for having a Palladian structure. Like, what does that tell you about a human in the world? And so I had actually done the biennial with Harold Zaman in 1999. And Anne Hamilton was doing the pavilion, and all of the toilets broke in the Italian pavilion. So she allowed us very generously to use the American bathrooms are a big deal in the pavilions. And so she allowed us to use it. And every time I went in there, I thought, what would I do here? So I had really, I mean, it's maybe heuristic, but I had been thinking about it. But I think about every space that way. Whenever any museum I go to, any public square, I think, how could art enliven this space? So for me, it was just a really exciting time. And I would say the most beautiful secret about doing a pavilion is that there's a time before the biennial opens where each artist is doing their work in their own pavilion. And it's like a studio school. And you go over and, you have lunch with Mark Manders, or, you all go over and you talk to Jeremy Deller, and you have a community that's like nothing else. So I think Venice is for me especially because we lived out of the main tourist part, is just a spectacular, even physical space. Just the history of that as a landmass, it will always blow me away. So,
well, thank you for sharing this. This is a very different perspective, of course, than all of us have. If we go to the next slide, we actually have the next biennial, which is very, very ephemeral, which I think is such a beautiful gesture after having all attention, that you here go into nature and have this very much more ephemeral piece. And if we go to the next slide, because I think that's yet another turning point, you are very intrigued by the fact how we are seeing things and how we are seeing the world and how fragmented we look at the world. That was my question when I talked about the first at Pratt, the first work with the toilet paper, or the Untitled Studio. This was a gallery show, but it was a gallery show where you explicitly directed everybody's attention how we are framing things, how we are looking at things. Do you want to elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're absolutely right about the piece before and this piece. What I loved about doing the biennial, I'm very grateful that Oakley and Wazer invited me back, surprisingly, after I had done the pavilion, because it gave me the opportunity to do the exact opposite, to do something that was discovered, not presented. And I've always been interested in the process of seeing a work being a continual sense of discovery, not a presentation. And that garden really had that. And that hammock was entirely made out of paint. And so there's this really interesting stage right here where there's this kind of longing to really, I think for me, investigate, this strange line between objects and images again. Can the paint become an actual sculpture? It's material, especially why would we paint anymore? But the paint is so lush now that we have so much digital. So if you see this, there's paint strips on one side that are there's the green, the blue, and the orange are paint. But that we are receiving images at this point in my life at an insane rate. We don't know where they come from. We don't know where they're going. We don't know how they're manipulated. This is an entirely new way of looking at the world. We know that it's happened so quickly to us, and we've decided, I mean, so many people have written about this, but it's become operative, and it's become a way that we experience communication, love, making babies, reproducing and dying, and only accelerated, who knew it could accelerate more, but in the pandemic, right? It's that idea that we connect through it, the idea that, my friends who are doctors, COVID is this awful, still is, awful disease that when you die alone. And
yeah.
Doctor friends of mine told me that the worst experience of their doctor, these like oncologists mostly, which is pretty grim profession, but it was just standing with an iPad with your loved ones, waiting for someone to die. not have that tactile experience of being with someone you love in that moment in your life. As just such an extreme example of this, but I think that this idea of, you know, how we navigate images and how they affect the way we really live in fundamental ways is probably going to be one of the biggest questions of my generation.
Thank you for sharing this, because of course I know that your family is very close also with your partner, your husband, to medicine and to practicing medicine, but also thinking about it and writing about it. And that was such a thoughtful comment. Thank you. Do a little deep breath here and let's go to the next. This is a work where I mentioned before that you are more and more elaborately making clear that your work is not only sculpture, not only installation, not only conceptual work, but it's also a perception instrument. It's also a perception machine in a way, or model of the world and all its complexity. So perhaps we watch, I think we have 2 videos of this work here. It's a Rose Museum. You have the cheetah running projected onto the objects here. And I think we have another video. Yeah. Timekeeper, it's a Rose Museum. So while you fragment, we saw the mocha piece, which we talked about is one of the first pieces where you brought video in and the fragmentation of projection into your works. I want to actually, after this, because we come back to this thread, I want to go towards painting. And your studio and us, we prepared a little essay and we go slowly. We have 6 slides. It's a little bit an essay within the slideshow. So perhaps we go to the first. And perhaps, Sarah, what we do is we go slide by slide and then you redirect to some of them. So we go to the next. I think it's, and a huge thank you for, and then we go to the next. You have such an important context. So we go to the next. And again to the next. And here a detail. So I think while we talk, perhaps we go slowly back and forth in the slides. So we have a different perspective. It's a little bit like in a studio when you look at everything and then you go very close to a work. For many, it came a bit as a surprise that you, 20 years after everybody learned about your work, you became so much more focused on the process of painting. You're trained as a painter, you always painted. But say a bit about what made you focus on painting in a different way.
So can we go back to the first one, actually? It's nice, Klaus chose these, so.
Thank you.
So it's funny because I did a show at Haus der Kunst, and one of the things that I realized was this, and this was a print that the museum asked me to make as a donation to raise money for the show. And throughout my entire practice, I actually collected video, collected photographs, and made prints. I taught printmaking at Columbia for about 15 years with Kiki Smith, and I love the process of printmaking. And so I've had a practice of printmaking, but what was interesting that I realized in this print was I realized that printmaking had always been a gift. It was always to give away for charities or to give to friends. It was never to be seen. And that space is a really interesting space because it didn't have to be anything for anyone, right? Because it was like, it was an offering in some ways. And this print was actually an important piece where I just had so much joy in making it for the museum that, and you can go to the next one. You can see in the next one, this is what my studio wall looked like. So in the upper left-hand corner, that's actually the drawing for Haus der Kunst. There's photographs of Haus der Kunst. There's the printout of the bird is one of the videos from it. That's a print of the Haus der Kunst print. And you see these little paintings that I was making. I would make them. There's a Muybridge printout from the web that has, a classic Muybridge bird flying. And there's drawings for Victoria Miro's gallery where I was making another kind of timekeeper. I started calling them timekeepers, these video pieces. But the studio was a collection of images itself. And I think it was Victoria who came to my studio around this time and said, these are paintings, you're making paintings. And there was a few other artist friends of mine who I've known a long time who said, you should just make painting. Don't be a sculptor. I remember that. Don't be a sculptor who makes flat work. Just like make a painting, commit to it, which was very scary to me. And I had a separate room. I had a separate studio where I painted. I didn't show anyone. And then I made my work. It was kind of like Duchamp, maybe, like remember when he was playing, he said he was just playing chess, but he was actually, making this incredible piece.
And you were very modest about it. I remember you were very, very kind to organize an artist dinner before I left New York to come to MoCA. And it was at your house. And you and Siddharth were cooking. It was really, really beautiful. And it was all artists. And I sat at the table and there was a painting in the room. And I didn't know who the painter was. And I felt completely embarrassed. I thought, like, how do I not know whose works that is? And I very shyly asked her, I said, oh God, who is that painting by? And you nearly didn't say that it was yours. That was the first time I saw one of your paintings. And you were very, very humble about it. It was that year. It is exactly that time. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I felt like this also, one of the things that I was thinking about, which you pointed out in terms of, I was always thinking about the sculpture being like there's a word, a jig, that's like a sculptural idea where you set up a system, you build something to create a system to rebuild something else. So like the pendulum that's in the piece that is at MoMA now, that was in Venice that you saw, that piece is all made by the piece itself, because you drop the pendulum and then you place the objects. So I was always interested in a piece being a tool, and the planetariums are really like the tool for the images around it. All of the videos are actually all the cameras are in the piece, nothing is hidden. So this idea of the live space of making has always been really important to me. So this as an image is interesting to me because it is the studio. There's nothing contrived about it. It's exactly the information I was looking at. So if you go to the next one, which is interesting, then I started to play with this idea of, so how do you move the studio, which is always what I was interested in. The timekeeper piece at Tanya's, but it was my desk. It literally was my editing desk brought to the gallery. So in London, in Victoria's space, I basically took a measurement, and if you look closely at this, I measured where everything had been put in the studio, and that's a photograph of my studio then in the London gallery, and then I replaced it. So it was this kind of, how do you make a piece actually a kind of kit or a system to make itself and remake itself. And even the idea of how do you preserve an artwork was something that was always interesting to me, and why I was interested in these fragile living things. Like how, I love that people would come and say, well, to a museum, say, well, how can you have a live plant? You water it, right? But there's this care. And so there was, to make the works themselves actually document themselves was an interesting idea. So this was a painting that came from, it's a painting of a sculpture. So that's what I also realized I started doing, is I started painting the sculptures, which actually it was John Elderfield came to my studio and he said, "Oh, this is like the oldest idea in the book. You look at people like Cezanne. He never made sculptures, but he would always go and paint them. Like this idea that you paint from a sculpture or you draw from a sculpture is a really strange idea. But that you go to the museum and you draw a Bernini instead of drawing. So this is a kind of interesting idea. So I started painting my own, my own memories of how, so this felt what it was like to be at Haus der Kunst to me, more than it was even to be there. And it didn't matter that it represented that place, but that's what it was. And then I did things like, that's actually, people may not know this, but that's my fingerprint. So like the white part of it is the fingerprint. If you go back, if you go back, I don't know if you got it, but that is a huge blown up print of mine. So this idea of printing and a basic imprint, almost like a Lascaux print of a painting. How do you get a painting? What can a painting do that a sculpture can't? Was always an interesting idea to me. What can a video do that a painting can't? And where do they overlap and become more interesting in juxtaposition? And not in a hybrid way. I think the use of the word hybrid is wrong for many people use that in the art right now, because hybrid is a combination of two genetic systems. But when a hybrid comes, they're sterile. They can't reproduce. And so it's really an amalgamation where you put two things together and they become a generating system, right? So that's something that's very interesting to me about process right now, is how one thing generates the next, how one thing becomes another thing. And that's why I love retrospectives, because you can see at any one stage, an artist can go in 20 different directions. And it's the space in between the next work where you say, oh, this is what they decided was important about that piece. And then this is where they went here, which is what you're doing right now.
Thank you for allowing me to edit. Thank you. So we go to the next. It was an incredible essay. And I put this after this because I think what you were just saying about, let's say, not hybrid, because hybrid is not fertile. Thank you for the definition. But this is a juxtaposition that is actually incredibly productive in understanding more what you're talking about in the dialogue between your sculptural work, your projection work, your performative work, your painting work, and I think since we are actually Zooming with you while you're in your studio, that's the reason I'm rushing a little bit, because I think it would be incredible to have a moment with you walking around. I don't know, are you on something that is movable, or is that a big desktop?
No, it's movable, yeah.
Perfect. We are not there yet. No movement yet, please. But I was just wondering, I thought I hadn't asked you before if we could do that. If we go to the next slide, this is a monumental work that has been completed last year. Perhaps we watch, the first one is a video. And the video is a rendering of it that you did before, or is that a documentation of it in space?
The documentation is the real thing.
Incredible.
You can see it goes from day to night, and I like that. So this is the piece in LaGuardia that we were tasked with putting up at the height of the pandemic, so that the airport could open. And it's a piece where I wanted the sort of this idea of a globe to actually kind of appear in the mind of the viewer, but there's no solid globe. It's really a scaffolding. So this idea, it's a kind of architectural idea that the scaffolding is actually, only holding up ornament that then creates our idea of a space. And it goes from dusk till dawn. So it's a timekeeper. And then where it's night, there's a hole. So when you look up into it, you see in the very edge, you can see where sunset and sundown happen, which obviously happen very quickly. In the middle, it's noon. And so I wanted to try and create a kinetic sculpture that would tell time as you moved around it. Because obviously in this kind of space, video, movement is really tough in a airport. So to make monumental or even anti-monumental permanent work that still feels intimate, that feels live, that feels like it changes in space. That's always been, we haven't shown a lot of my public pieces, but for me to make public art challenging in that way, so that it doesn't feel like something you pass by, but that marks space in a way that I think public art only can, has been something I've always been committed to.
I can't wait to experience this in person. If we go to the next, this is a drawing of your work for Cartier. And I mentioned before that we actually wanted to do the original Zoom invite, Zoom studio visit, like basically while you were in Paris. But I can only imagine how incredibly complex it is to install an exhibition like this. If we go to the next, there's a video that gives a little bit of an impression. And who has been to the Cartier Foundation? Of course, this is the incredible translucency and transparency of the glass building that you are working with. Here, another photograph. And I think we have a photograph where we see it from the outside, which is really beautiful. If we go to the next, yeah. So here's the work talking about the translucency, and there is this space of like a wild garden between the building inside and then the urban outside, where there's another glass wall to the city. And if we go to the next.
So this is the other side. There's two sides to the building, and this is actually a piece in the making. So again, this has a pendulum in it, and it hangs to the center. And this piece was created. It's stainless steel, polished on the top, but it's laid out by it's made by using a pendulum to sort of slice a space. This idea of using kind of the most basic tool that anyone could have. If you go to the next one, I don't know. It's all a mystery because you did the slides. Okay, I didn't know if you put it. It's all made out of clay. That it's made by hand, which I also think is important to the piece.
But I think important. Please go ahead, Sarah.
You want me to tell you a little bit about it or no?
Yes, I was only trying to get more information out of you. That was all. Please.
That I didn't have a visa to go to France. Luckily, the woman who was installing there, I've done Venice with, and she lives in Paris. So we did everything on Zoom, and we did everything on GoPros. And it was kind of, for all of us, it's amazing to see how much we can or cannot do, of course, virtually, right? This is like the big experiment of the year. So the other side was pretty much done, but a lot of the time in a show, I will try and keep like 25% not done, so it has that improvisational feeling. And so this side, luckily, I got a visa from the consulate. I jumped on a plane. I got there before it closed, and we did this piece. Is this a video?
Yes.
You want to play it? And the thing that was very interesting about this piece was that something happening. There's pendulum moving, and then there's a video of a sun turning into a moon, like, similar to this kind of tracing of the sky in LaGuardia. But you can see it moves at the exact same speed. It's hard to see in this, but it moves at the same speed as the pendulum. So you have the real pendulum, you have the shadow of the pendulum, and then you have a digital object that moves. You can see a little bit there. And so you have this almost real AR quality of like, which is moving which, what's happening first and which not, between the analog and the digital, which I think is really interesting. And I will say, because I know you know her work really well, the early work of Janet Cardiff, I think, is very interesting that way, where you had this confusion about what was the artwork and what was life, in this moment that I'm very interested in. And this piece, you have to stand there and see it. But the confusion of this thing moving and the video moving and then the object moving, your brain cannot, you sit between all three at once. And so that was a really interesting thing that could only happen by being there installing in person. So the two things that were like, could not have, three, that kind of moment, the fact that there's video on the floor in the other side, and sound. I could never have done them remotely. And it's this idea of a surround sound experience of the world that we lose, that we're sort of muffled by in the digital. And that doesn't mean that I don't think the digital is an interesting space. I think, like I said to you, I think it's interesting to think about what does one medium do better than anything else. And what I think the digital does is I think it creates longing.
What I try to also comment on with this one is, in the sequencing here, you have in the very beginning of your work, perhaps we play that video again and stop it at some point, because there's a very important moment in it, and I will kindly say stop when we get there. You did models of the world, models of urban agglomerations, and with the observer, let's stop it here. A little bit back. Let's go like a second back, if we can do that. A little bit back, even more. Yeah, just here, exactly. So at this, you see both rooms. So you see the projection observatory, the rotation, the projection here, and you see the pendulum space, the other. I think what you, as a synthesis of so much of your work with Cartier, there is the observatory, there is the model of a scientific instrument that makes you see the world differently, that makes you visualize time. You're showing time, it reminded me when I saw the pendulum moving, actually I thought about the Grand Canyon, because the Grand Canyon, like being carved out by thousands and thousands of years just out of the plateau with the water, the pendulum is the water. So for me, the Cartier show is bringing together so many different aspects of your work. And also, of course, the scientific approach that your models have. And then if we go to one more slide, you also tried something else out newly. We go to the next one. You did an augmented reality app. I hope I didn't totally completely misinterpret the show, but for me, it's actually such an important show how you put this together, Sarah.
No, absolutely. I mean, one of the things was I wanted to, the idea was that also that the show could be seen at day, could be seen at night, and could be seen outside and inside. So the whole building becomes like a magic lantern, because all of the video, so you come from the street, and that building by Jean Nouvel is really, I think, a masterpiece. And it's fundamentally about screens and mirages. So you see images of the street, real images, and when cars go by, you see, lights go by, then you see the outside, then you see the inside, and then you go inside the works. So there are those steps. And the augmented reality was originally made for the garden, so that when you were in the garden, you would have the images that were going around. You would look at in your phone, the images would come into your phone, and you would see the images. So that it was a way of blurring the piece into the garden. Because the show was closed and has still been closed it was open for about 6 days. That augmented reality now becomes something where you go in your house and you have a piece of the work in your house, and so that was really the point of it. I think that for me, a lot of augmented reality and VR there are so many tools that are unnecessary. So it's really interesting to me right now to figure out. I think there will be very necessary uses of it. There's actually, I don't know if you put it in, but I sent you a picture of how the Storm King piece is being made with augmented reality. But this idea of being able to transfer an experience into someone else's private space, I think is an interesting part of augmented reality.
That's incredible to learn about this, Sarah. Yes, and the Storm King is in to your question. So let's go for the, we have.
And then this is called that, sorry, good. That's called Night Vision, that piece. It's an app, you can download it. And it was this idea of sort of being able to see things in your world that are maybe there that you can't perceive.
So
like an animal who has a kind of night vision that you don't, or a fly you can see, you know, things at all in all ways. But anyways,
will you work more with augmented reality, Sarah?
I mean, I think that I'm a big fan of using technology when it's necessary, and I think that often it's used because there's fun tools. I feel like the hammer was created because it needed the nail, and the nail needed the hammer, and there are a lot of creative tools that are made that are unnecessary. Like this, the most important thing for me for this is it's a phone and it's a flashlight. Like, you know, and those are like concrete things, and it's a camera, you know, and there's 1,000 things that it does that I will never need. So for this show, this was an important thing. For Storm King, I'll show you, like, that's the augmented reality. It's a tool. I think in medicine, there are unbelievable applications of it. And I think there are unbelievable applications. I think we just should be wary of just like a lot of architecture. I feel like if you know the architectural programs, you can tell they're just using the push-pull tool, you know, and you lose a kind of creativity. But so this is a piece I'm doing for Storm King that's going to open in about a month. So right in the middle of it.
Oh, could you play the video? Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
So one of the ideas for this piece was really to create a piece that camouflaged into nature. So this is why this video is important. And the idea is that when you move around this piece, it will both appear and disappear with the nature around it, and that it will be different at different seasons. It will reflect, different environments, whether it's snow, whether it's rain, in different ways. So we will always be in dynamic conversation with the nature around it. If we go to the next one, maybe. So that's the underbelly sort of how it's going to be. It's about 150 separate pieces that are made to have a kind of entropic quality into the earth, so that the conversation of the earth, what the earth's doing to it and what it's doing to the earth, is supposed to be sort of married, if you will. I wanted to bring the sky into the earth. And sort of harness it below you. That was the basin of a very, very large tree that had died. So it had left this kind of basin that I identify as a place that really felt like it needed to be occupied. And the AR is used because each one of those objects, because it's a perfect bowl, each of one of those objects, if it's off by an inch, it ruins that mirage of the bowl. But it's a piece that's supposed to be both very present and also be easy to quickly disappear.
Incredible. When is this meant to be ready, Sarah?
It's we're going to be installing very soon. I mean, that you saw the image of us.
Yeah.
So it's going to be ready by the end of May.
That's incredible. Beautiful. I love Storm King, and this will be such an important kind of additional piece. Incredible.
Yeah, it's permanent. We've been working on it for about 10 years. So to have it installed at this moment, I think is special because it's so hard to see art indoors. So it's really nice that it will be in a place where people can move freely around art.
But also your work often is very kind of process-based. If you think about the subway station you did, you worked like a decade on this year, you say, even the Cartier show was the second show you did in that building. And you were talking about the American Pavilion, visiting Anne Hamilton and saying, oh, what would I do? So I think your process is also very much a long-term research about spaces and opportunities and challenges and how could that be fabricated. This is amazing. I was wondering how actually one could exactly create these forms shaped like that perfect bowl, as you say. We arrive in the here and now, Sarah. You're sitting in your studio. We see something in the background that looks similar to what we have in the slideshow. If we go to the next. Sarah, would you possibly share with us like a walk through your studio?
Sure. I mean, it is not finished, but my idea, so when you do a permanent, they only do a permanent piece. I think the last piece was Martin Puryear's Nets, and the one before was Myelin, and Richard Serra before that. It's very few because they can't fill the space up. But when you do a show in the building there. And my idea for the building was to try and sort of create, one of my interests in painting is this idea of creating a portal that, something that I figured out is, that seems very obvious, but that paintings can create mental space. They can create imaginary space, but they aren't space. They're very little space. They're a board, right? They're sculptural boards or flats. But they create mental space. And so I wanted to make a painting that kind of blew out a portal in the entire side of the room indoors, so that you spend all this time outdoors and then you go inside and you're thrown into another world. So it's a 50-foot painting that's exactly the length of that room. So it has also, for me, a conversation about both murals, about Renaissance paintings that were always built to the architecture itself. A lot of the light that you see in it is actually photographs or videos put back into it that are, you can see it both in paint picture and in space, but that are like filmed in the space, so that when you're in the space, you'll get the light of the space and then you'll get a video of the light in the space. There are moments like photographs of people. I decided to use hands instead of, as you saw, I was a figurative painter, and I was this idea of how do you bring the figure back into a painting without it being so literal. So in this one, there are all these hands.
Are you using a laptop or an iPad, Sarah?
I have a laptop. I wish it would be easier if it was an iPad, but
an iPad, I asked an artist friend to get really, really close to a painting. I wouldn't do that with a laptop. We don't want to have a scratch.
I don't know, maybe it's.
Wow, incredible.
But,
that's incredible.
So, and there's video actually in it. I don't know if you can see. It's not reading. Is it reading? It's funny. It doesn't read on the thing. There's a few places that you can, but I can walk you sort of across it. I don't know. It's hard.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. No, that's great.
Know where to walk in, and you can see this is reflected on the floor. So I'm doing this idea that it's almost like a print. I actually did a piece at Victoria Rose that was like a print on the wall that printed down to the floor. And
is the floor that we see right now part of it, or is that just a studio floor?
It's going to be part of it. So like that is actually, it's almost as if there's an idea of like a ghost print in printmaking, where what a ghost print is like when you clean the press at the end, you just keep running it until there's nothing left. And so you get kind of a remnant of the image. And this idea for me about an after image, or how an image burns into our memory, is something I'm very interested in. And so, this idea that on the floor you have a kind of, it's almost as if this entire painting could fall like a plate and come up, and what is left on the floor is kind of a remnant of it. And there is, you can see video in it here. So, and this light, light is actually painted from the light that's in the space.
Where's the projector?
The projectors are all right here. They just, that's my, everything's in the piece, but you just don't sort of look and see it. But when it's in this, but the projector is all projecting light that's recorded from the space itself, so that when you're in the space, you'll get the light that's actually happening as the sun moves, but you'll also get the recording of the light as the sun moves. So you'll have this kind of confusion of real light and of recorded light, even though it is the real light of the space, but recorded at different times. I'm doing some very strange camera work because a laptop.
I love your camera work. I have one practical question, Sarah.
Yes.
When you have such an immersive work including the floor and the light and the projection and the projectors, do you focus on one side of the studio? Are the other walls basically all dedicated to serve this one work, or do you have other works at the same time in the studio, Sarah?
You mean like
I mean, is this like a theater where you have a stage, or is this like a room where you have works on all walls? Is this happening?
So I busted out that so it could be long enough because I didn't have
Yeah.
a 50 wall, but like here you can see I have like these are like to figure out how
Yeah.
that would work in space. I did a smaller version of it to figure out how it's called for right now it's called fifth season because it's actually divided into four seasons in my mind.
Yeah.
And I had this used to be my secret. I'm telling you all these used to be my secret painting
We feel
space.
very honored. Thank you.
That was my secret painting space, which is so it was a tiny space before I painted it. And then I have three other spaces that are one of them is video, one of them is a shop, and one of them is just for works on paper. So I try because I'm doing, you know, all of those. We have a ceramic place, you know, I'm doing all of these different mediums. So, but we just this room has never been this big. I just took down a wall so that we could fit the painting in.
Wow. Thank you so much for that tour.